Valerie Plame Wilson is here. She is, as you know, the former spy whose work for the CIA was publicly disclosed in a July 2003 article by columnist Bob Novak. The investigation into the leak led to the conviction of Scooter Libby, Vice President Dick Cheney's chief of staff. Libby was convicted of lying to FBI agents and grand jurors. His sentence was later commuted by President Bush. Valerie Plame Wilson's book, Fair Game, My Life as a Spy, My Betrayal by the White House, was recently published, and I am pleased to have her here on this program to talk about not only this book, but her life, which is in this book. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Nice to have you here. Tell me, 22 years old, you go to become an employee of the CIA. Why did you do that? Was it parents? Was it what?
Well, I can't say that I grew up thinking that I wanted to join the CIA.
But I remember your parents were military, weren't they?
That's right. My father was a career Air Force officer, served in World War II in the South Pacific. Right. My brother was a wounded Marine Corps Vietnam veteran, so this theme of public service ran deeply in my family. And I thought this idea of serving my country overseas, living and working overseas in a career that seemed exciting, it was enticing.
Was it exciting?
Yes, it was. I loved my career. Yeah. And if none of this had happened, I would be living overseas right now working on counterproliferation issues.
Okay, we'll come back to that. What happens when you go to them and apply for a job and they accept you? What do they do then? What's the training to be a CIA employee?
First, as you may know, the agency has taken the position that I'm not permitted to acknowledge my agency affiliation prior to January 2002, despite all the information out there on my background and career. But what I can tell you is that you go through a very intense battery of psychological exams, medical. They're testing you in every way to make sure that you got the right stuff.
And so what was it, the right stuff? All right, so you have this career overseas. You come back to Langley. Can you talk about that? I just want to walk through this, and you can tell me, and we're not going to spend a long time, but just tell me what you can tell me. You come back to Langley so we can talk about this book.
At a certain point, I was back at CIA headquarters, and I can talk about in the run-up to the war with Iraq. I was working for Counterproliferation Division, and particularly within that, I was working on, we'll call it the Iraq Task Force. And the mission of that task force was to go after the scientists in the presumed WMD programs in Iraq. Try to see where they were in their research, how much they where they were procuring their different equipment and material needed for these different programs. Because remember, in 1998, Saddam Hussein had thrown out the UN inspectors. So the intelligence we had on where they were and how far developed these programs were was very thin.
Okay, that was my next question. How good was your intelligence? Did you have a lot of information there? Did you believe, and most of your colleagues believe, that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction? Was it a failure of intelligence to know that he didn't?
I think what is fair to say, in the shadow of 9/11, it would not have been prudent, to say the least, to have given him the benefit of the doubt, because there's no doubt he was an evil tyrant. He had used WMD on his own people. He was clearly looking for things. We didn't know, though, where they were in this, in this buildup. The administration kept talking about the imminent threat. Remember, how many times did we hear about smoking gun in the shape of the mushroom cloud? So our job as intelligence professionals, and what I was doing, was running worldwide operations, trying to get at these scientists, either in country, if they came out for an international conference, if they had perhaps relatives.
So they come out for an international conference, you want to talk to them, you or one of your colleagues.
Oh, desperately, we want to speak to them.
And they were saying to you what when they would come out?
Well, by and large...
What was our information?
By and large, they were saying there's really nothing there. But please don't forget, you couldn't take the first thing they said as the absolute truth, because I would say it was analogous to dealing with Russians under the Soviet regime, in that their whole culture was certainly attuned differently. A lot of the Iraqi scientists were doing sort of the to jail to laboratory and back again. So what they were saying had to be very carefully, couched in terms. So what I'm trying to say is we didn't necessarily take their denials that there was anything going on in their WMD programs the first time.
Well, the most important thing to be said also is that Saddam Hussein did not act like someone who had nothing to hide. He acted like he had something to hide. And Hans Blix and others have said it was baffling to them. If he didn't have them, why did he act like he did?
Well,
do you have an answer to that question?
Well, what's come out since then, I think it was very interesting. Even within his most innermost circle, some of his close advisors thought that Iraq did have WMD, that they were very...
He fooled them.
He fooled them. And others knew that, in fact, none existed. And this was, of course, to play his own domestic political power games as well as
with
regional
his neighbors.
ones.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Exactly. Hans Blix says that if, in fact, they were there, they would have found them. And that the great tragedy is they did not let the inspectors continue.
I fully agree. I felt that there was clearly a rush to war. It takes time to vet your assets, to corroborate that information, check it against other sources, and there was truly a rush to war. And I remember on the eve of war feeling just absolutely sick because I thought we hadn't found it. We had failed. We hadn't done our job. I and all my former colleagues were working as hard as we possibly could to try to get senior policymakers solid intelligence, and it was really thin.
And you needed more time.
And indeed, everything cascaded from 9/11. As we know, they went from the focus on Afghanistan to literally days later, the smoke is still coming off the ruins of the World Trade Tower when Secretary Rumsfeld is looking at the targets in Iraq. And then it was off to the races. And because we had really started at zero at that point, the level of activity needed to bring in some good intelligence just went off the charts.
I think George Tenet has spoken to this issue, but I'm sure you've read his book as well. It is that at no time did they feel like, or you tell me if your opinion is different, that they were being asked to lie about the evidence they had. No one was saying to the CIA, they may have been looking for evidence they hadn't seen, but no one was saying, make up the evidence.
Well, of course not. It's not that overt. But there,
How does it work?
Well, there was an unprecedented number of visits to CIA headquarters by Vice President Cheney and his then Chief of Staff,
And what were
Scooter
they
Libby.
about? And what was the conversation? Were you in on the meeting?
No, they were meeting with analysts.
Yeah.
I was not present for any of those. But apparently they kept coming back and sort of asking the same questions over and over again.
Like, why can't you find this for us? We need this.
I don't want to speculate on what their questions were, but the analysts at the CIA are pretty smart.
And what was their response to all this? What did they think was going on?
At the time, they had to feel a subtle pressure that they weren't giving the administration the answers that they wanted.
Was Secretary Powell came out at the time of the UN speech for 3 or 4 nights before, right before he had to make this speech. And he was unhappy with what he was seeing that was coming from the CIA. Yes?
That's what published reports have said. He kept going to the CIA and going over the evidence, the intelligence, and I think it's very telling that, notice, he did not include that bit of we've learned from the British government that,
right,
the infamous,
stuff.
the whole yellow cake.
Obviously, I'm getting to that. But here's what's interesting to me about when the speech was made by Colin Powell at the United Nations with George Tenet sitting right behind him. You say you were sickened. Tell me what the reaction was.
It was the first time that I have to say I got my head sort of out of the operational weeds, because up until that point, I've been busy, really busy, along with all my colleagues, trying to get a good intelligence running, safe operations, secure, effective operations. And here, for the first time, we were all gathered around the TV at the headquarters, seeing what he would have to say, because he was held in such high esteem. And he is saying things and using pieces of evidence that I know that doesn't match up with the intelligence that I was privy to.
Explain to me how that happened. Because Colin Powell knows that the first line of his obituary is going to include that UN speech.
There is, in particular, the one case codenamed Curveball.
First paragraph, perhaps.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
The codenamed Curveball, who, in fact, the CIA never managed to meet with him directly. He was under German control. Yeah. His reporting had been completely discredited.
Well, and Tyler had said, we don't believe in this guy.
Tyler Drumheller, exactly.
He was head of CIA Europe, as I remember.
That's correct. And here, Secretary Powell is citing Curveball as the primary source on these mobile biological weapons labs.
And here there is a dispute between George Tenet, McLaughlin, and Tyler Drumheller, right, who says, yes, I came there and I met with McLaughlin. And Tenet knew of my protest about Curveball, yet it ends up in a speech by Colin Powell.
It's outrageous.
It is. But how did it? Who's lying? And why did Powell do it?
Well, there's pretty clear evidence that that wasn't the one and only time. It wasn't like one phone call the night before Powell's supposed to make his UN speech.
Right.
The whole community understood that Curveball's reporting was really discredited.
The whole intelligence community at Langley, or the whole community what?
Well, I think it's fair to say that those who were aware of the case knew that the reporting was really unreliable.
And did DOD know that? Did the White House know that? Did the Vice President's office know that?
That I can't speak to, but I think it's a very good example of intelligence that is cherry-picked and manipulated in order to support this rationale for going to war in Iraq.
So when the President made his speech, when Powell made his speech, when the country is moving towards war, how much of the CIA said, God, this is wrong?
You know, in the run-up to the war, I never heard any of my former colleagues say they were for or against the war.
You said that. Yeah.
And as it should be, that is completely inappropriate. Professional intelligence officers are just supposed to dish up the facts, cold. And I think that, if anything, I would say there was an unease, as I felt, that we hadn't done our job. That here we are going
supposed to serve the president, give him information he can use to make a decision about going to war or not, and we haven't done our job.
Not only that, but as we go to war, our troops, the U.S. troops, are perhaps very vulnerable because we did not find the one cache, or we didn't discover the one secret site that where all the work had been done.
And you feared that if they had weapons of mass destruction, they could use them against the American troops.
Absolutely.
Whether it was gas, or whether it was biological, or whether it was
nuclear.
Mm-hmm. So when we went to war, how did you feel?
I thought it was ill-considered. My feeling at the time was this was a rush, and I did not see, I was not privy to evidence that there was an imminent threat, and that's what it was all about, that there was an imminent threat.
Let's go to Joe Wilson for a second. You met Joe Wilson at a Turkish embassy party or something?
It was at the Turkish ambassador's residence.
So how long before you got married?
We married about a year after we met.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And your politics were the same, not the same?
We were both, in our worldview was the same. We had same sense of humor, same value system. I mean, we just clicked right away. There was no question. We didn't talk a whole lot of politics, believe it or not, then. We were interested in serving our country.
He then, take me to his designation, which is central to everything that's happened to you, to go to Niger and on behalf of the CIA. Mm-hmm. First, they call him in for a little Q&A to talk to him to see if he's right. Yes?
Mm-hmm, that's right.
We know whose idea it was first.
Well, let me tell you how it happened. In February 2002, a young officer who worked for me, who's normally pretty unflappable, came to me a little undone because she had just received a phone call from someone in the vice president's office. We still don't know who that was. And they wanted more information on this report of this alleged sale of yellow cake uranium from Niger to Iraq. Right. So, and I got to say, there's established protocols. There are channels. If there's a policymaker who wants more information or clarification or confirmation of intelligence, There's means to do that. You don't just ring up a junior officer at the CIA headquarters and say, I'd like some more.
Right.
So she was quite undone about this. And as we were discussing this,
how would it normally happen?
There are whole ways of having, when a senior policymaker is briefed, it goes back into the DIA. You know, it's bureaucratic, but it's for that reason. It's bureaucratic and channeled, so that the very reason that a senior policymaker doesn't get a hold of raw intelligence and go on a tear on it, because you need to be able to put it into context and understand the credibility of the source. Have they reported before? Where does this fit into whatever else we have? So a reports officer came by and overheard what was happening, and he said, well, what about Joe? And the reason he said, what about Joe, was he knew that Joe had lived and worked in Africa as a diplomat for over 20 years.
But not in Niger, but had worked in...
Joe, I think that was his first posting in Niger.
It was in Niger. Okay.
I think it was. He had served as our charge d'affaires at the embassy in Baghdad in the run-up to the first Gulf War. He had met with Saddam Hussein. He'd arranged for the safe release of many American hostages. And he'd also done some other missions for the CIA in previous years on similar topics. So when he said, what about Joe, it was because he was a known quantity, and his bona fides were impeccable.
And you said?
And I said, well, let's go talk to our boss and see what he says. So we told him, and my boss said, well, Val, when you go home tonight and you see Joe, do you mind asking him to come into CIA headquarters next week, and we'll talk to him and see what we need to do. Yeah, see if this is a good idea. Who knows? And by the way, could you also send an email to the chief of the division, let him know what's going on? And it was that email that was later
used to indicate that it was your idea.
That I had suggested him, I had recommended him. We can talk about that later.
Yeah, did Joe ever say that he thought that this came at the request of Cheney? Did he ever say that?
That it was his impression
that...
No, it's the office of the vice president. He's very clear about that. He was clear about it in the op-ed piece.
So he was actually wrong when he said that, when he said, I went at the request of the office of the vice president, or not?
No, he wasn't wrong, because he knew that's where the request had originated.
First idea.
But
the request was not to send him. The request was to find out more about Niger.
That's correct.
Right.
And in Mr. Libby's trial, a lot of evidence came out, documentary and witness both. And one was a memo written by the INR, which is the intelligence portion of the State Department. And in it, it was very clear that Joe Wilson didn't particularly think he needed to go to Niger, because there were already 2 reports on this. One from our ambassador on the ground there, and another one debunking it, saying there's nothing to this. The other one was written by a 4-star Army general and said, that there's nothing to this allegation. But it's in the agency's DNA, if you will, that when the president or the vice president says, I want something more on this, to hop to it and say, we will do everything we can.
We'll go look. We'll check. We'll triple check. We'll quadruple check. Yeah. Joe goes and he comes back and he says nothing, right?
Yeah, there's no there.
No there, right. And then he writes an op-ed.
Well, later.
Okay, but how much later was that?
Well, Joe's trip was in February 2002. The war opens March 2003.
Right.
And in the intervening time, when the president had made those now infamous 16 words, until Joe wrote his op-ed piece, he had spent that time pursuing back channel, discreetly, trying to understand, talking to staffers on Capitol Hill, talking to his former colleagues at the State Department. How did that whopper get into the president's State of the Union address?
Had it been taken out at another time? At
least
the request of George Tenet?
At least on four occasions.
But it still ended up how did that happen? Do we know? Who kept putting it back?
Different people, but I think in the State of the Union address, finally, it was Bob Joseph who managed to put it back in at the last minute.
Okay. So
he was at the NSC.
So there it is, 16 words in a State of the Union address.
And Joe was trying very hard to understand how that happened. And he was warned in June 2003 that he would probably be named. There was articles coming out that it was going to start spinning out of control unless, he did something.
Well, then he went to a conference and Nick Kristof was there, right?
That's correct.
They were at a conference, somebody, and Nick says, why don't you write a column?
No, I don't think that happened at that time, but what this conference was a gathering of Democratic senators, right. And Joe was invited as a panel participant, along with Christoph. But then in July 2003, finally, as a matter of conscience and principle, he decided to write his op-ed piece.
And what do you make of the notations that they found with Cheney's handwriting on that I guess he gave to Scooter or somebody?
Yes, and showed up in Mr. Libby's trial. Yeah. Yes, do they do this often? Yeah. Is it normal? Did his wife send him on a junket or a boondoggle?
Suggesting a guy who's trying to figure out what the hell's going on here. Why is this guy...
Well, a couple things. First of all, anyone who knows anything about West Africa would know that a pro bono trip
is no picnic.
Is no boondoggle. Right. I mean, Niger is literally the poorest nation in the world. Dick Cheney has been around in government long enough to know that sometimes you do send U.S. citizens to provide information of value to the intelligence community. But I think most importantly is that margin notes from someone as senior as the vice president are never just idle doodles. They are not just little things that he's noting while he's talking on the phone. These are marching orders. And certainly that's how Joe and I interpreted
the orders to be. Get Wilson?
Absolutely. It's political payback. To paint this whole trip as a nepotism on my behalf that
political
somehow...
payback for the column he wrote questioning...
That's right. Right. For
the decision to go to work.
The audacity to question the primary reason, the primary rationale. And I think it's pretty clear that their strategy was, well, if you can question how this trip came about, that, his wife arranged it, then you can question his results, what he got. It's, the whole thing is thrown into suspect, becomes suspect.
And who do you think was complicit in that effort to get Joe Wilson? Payback, whatever term we use.
Well, the list is long.
Okay, but tell me who you think. I'm asking you, not who do you think? The vice president knew about it?
Well,
vice president knew. Scooter knew.
Joe and I have filed a civil suit, and it's against Vice President Cheney, Mr. Rhodes.
And what's the
Mr.
status
Libby.
Of that suit?
The status that it was dismissed, not on the merits of the case, because I think the judge understood that a great wrong had been done, but he understands that there's some.
Primarily to you, because your name had been disclosed. Is that the idea?
But to both of us, loss of privacy and so forth. And there's some really interesting and very important legal concepts that need to be determined. So it's going to be decided much higher up. So it's on appeal right now. I think we're waiting for a date.
And you're working on the appealing dismissal?
That's
correct.
The
idea? When the column was written by Bob Novak, tell me your reaction. What did you think? What did you feel? What did you say to yourself? What was the first 5 phone calls you made?
Well, I'll just tell you the first instant, because I'm thinking about all the assets, my network that I had worked, they are in jeopardy. Even people that I had had an innocuous relationship with, they would perhaps be looked at in a different way. I'm thinking about the safety of my family. At that time, our twins were 3.5. And I'm thinking about this career that I loved is over, as I knew it. And I could not believe that he did it.
Let me just understand, because I really do want to understand. You could not do the job you were doing at the CIA after that. It had been ruined by this disclosure.
Of course. Yeah, you can no longer work in a covert capacity.
I'm raising these questions, as you know, because the people don't understand whether you still had a covert capacity at that time, whether you still, or you were doing something else in terms of what you were doing with respect to nuclear proliferation that might have been different from what you were doing when you were running agents or whatever you might have been doing in Europe.
What the special prosecutor Fitzgerald said was that there was no doubt that up until the time my name was, and my covert affiliation was printed in the paper, I was working overseas, traveled extensively using a variety of covers, a variety of aliases, working in a covert capacity on operational issues. So there's no doubt about my covert status.
And therefore, your career doing that was
over.
Done. And there was no other career that you really wanted at the CIA.
No, that was the best job. I had the best job. I was highly trained to do that. I loved it. I derived a great sense of satisfaction working on these counterproliferation issues. It was over.
And we had the trial, and Scooter Libby was going to jail, and that sentence has been commuted by the president. Joe Wilson, and you two have moved to Santa Fe.
We have.
We now know that Rich Armitage, then the Deputy Secretary of State, had a meeting conversation with Bob Novak, and he was the first source for this. Do you think that Rich Armitage was part of any effort, or you think he just did this as a matter of conversation?
Well, as he himself has said, he was just gossiping.
Yeah.
And how foolish. This is a man who's been around Washington for decades. He should know better. How foolish. He might not have known exactly where in the CIA worked, but if you see someone's name and CIA, a red flag goes up, he had no business chatting about me to Mr. Woodward or Mr. Novak, which is why he's included on the civil suit. So, you know, he's been called no partisan gunslinger. I'm not going to comment on what his politics are or aren't, but I can tell you he was really very foolish to have done that.
And when you look back at this now, and I've asked this question earlier, I mean, Armitage, you said, was foolish, but not part of a president, because he was against, in some ways was against the war. Very strong pro-military guy, but against the war, had reservations about the war. I don't want to put words in his mouth. And clearly not part of any White House or vice presidential, especially vice presidential effort to get anybody. He was just foolish. I'm asking, you know where I'm going.
Well,
on one hand, a guy is foolish. On the other hand, in your judgment, on the other hand, there are people that you believe were out to get Joe Wilson.
Absolutely. It does not, the fact that Mr. Armitage chose to gossip about something that was highly ill-considered, I'll be kind, right, does not preclude the fact that there was a parallel and contemporaneous effort in the White House by many. As Prosecutor Fitzgerald said, he can't conceive of any evidence that would disprove a conspiracy by a multitude of people in the White House to discredit and undermine Joe Wilson.
I'm just asking one time, though, you don't believe that Rich Armitage was part of that at all?
Doesn't appear that he was. But he should not. I don't know.
No,
he
you made that clear.
Doing
it. But he was not part of. I mean, that's a distinct thing, because some people have raised this question. In terms of who was doing what. I mean, you believe what, say, about Karl Rove?
I will say this with respect to Armitage. Everyone was. It's not as though he was out of the loop entirely, and he just decided to chat about this issue and who I was. It's not exactly clear what happened, because don't forget, Mr. Libby was convicted on obstruction of justice. Couldn't get to the truth. We don't know exactly what happened.
It's also clear Mr. Armitage went in immediately to Fitzgerald and said, look, I know there's some question about who talked to Novak. I talked to Novak, correct?
I don't know if he went in immediately.
Well,
I think after it was made clear that he had been Mr. Novak's source, then he raised his hand and said yes.
So Fitzgerald knew it before he went in?
I believe so.
You think so? Yeah. So where are you today? You're just written a book.
Which is
You've lost the job that you've loved.
Mm-hmm.
Your husband, you love, and marriage survived the tension that was there, and you've got
now 7.5-year-old twins.
7.5-year-old twins living in Santa Fe. Where are you? What's your future?
It's been,
what do you want to do?
Well, it's been a long time getting here. It's been 4.5 years, but this is a really important story. I am not a public person, or certainly not by choice, shall I say. But I do think this is so important to tell the story, because it's the importance of speaking truth to power, the consequences of doing so, and Joe and I firmly believe that it's a great story to tell how important it is for we as citizens to hold our government to account for their words and deeds. So finally I get to tell this story in that. And as for what comes next, I don't know. It has just been such a wild and woolly ride, frankly. We look forward to just taking a breath. Joe and I want to move past this. We would like to contribute again in some way. I don't know how. But we have small children, and a little boy and a little girl, along with another set of twins, older. And when the little ones are grow up and read about this and understand a little bit more of these last tumultuous years, and they say, if they ever ask us, you mean you knew this and you didn't say anything? Joe and I want to have a really good answer to give them.
As to what you did and what happened and what the history of the time was for you. What would you want to know from Michael Hayden today?
What I want to know from General Hayden is what he plans to do to get the politics out of intelligence. Because I think that that is the most insidious trend we have seen, because it degrades the product, it certainly diminishes the mission, and of course does a grave disservice to our national security. So what steps is he going to take to, he really had a huge job taking over from Porter Goss. There's no question. Morale was at rock bottom. He needs to right the ship. So what is he going to do to get intelligence out of, to get politics out of the intelligence sphere?
Anyway, this book is called Fair Game, My Life as a Spy, My Betrayal by the White House. Valerie Plame Wilson with an afterword by Laura Rosen. Just quickly explain what that is, because that's interesting.
My publisher, Simon & Schuster, hired this investigative journalist, Laura Rosen, to draw upon all the information out there, as well as interviews, to put together this 50-page essay that basically fills in the blanks, so the reader has a really good picture of what's going on.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having me.
A conversation recorded on Monday with Valerie Plame Wilson, whose book is Fair Game. Tomorrow night, we begin our new series, a Charlie Rose special edition, The Candidates. First up, Governor Mike Huckabee, the former governor of Arkansas. Hope to see you then.